So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I realize it is Memorial Day weekend. There is other priorities, but nonetheless, every single one of you is important to this discussion. As I mentioned to David, it could be an audience of 2, it could be an audience of 2,000, and I still bring the same energy, so thank you for being here this afternoon. My plenary keynote lecture is really a follow-up to my dissertation, and so I'm actually back home. I spent 15 consecutive years here at UCLA. I hold 2 baccalaureate degrees, one in comparative literature, a second in Chicana and Chicana studies, a master's in education, and a PhD in education. And so my PhD doctoral dissertation focused specifically in really understanding the transfer experience through the entire post-secondary educational pipeline. So 20 years ago, actually 22 years ago, when I started my career here at UCLA, I really wanted to understand the phenomena of education. What, as a system, is it really doing to support historically underserved populations? And for that, I really had to dissect, for the state of California, the master plan. And so to really understand the master plan, I had to understand why are students of color specifically and low-income students marginalized within the bottom perceived sector of education. And so when we talk about theory, we really want to talk about what are we looking at and what lens do I use to understand this phenomenon. So for this particular presentation, it's going to be a different approach. I'm also a poet, and so I'm going to introduce how you use your voice within your research. Because one thing that advice I was given upon entering the PhD at the age of 22 was don't lose your voice, or if that, find your voice. And so when a faculty member said find your voice, I found that disrespectful. I said, I have a voice. That's the reason why I gained an entrance to a PhD at such an early age. But what he was really telling me was that academia, as a system, is also oppressive. And if you don't care for your agenda, and you don't care for your standpoint, they'll silence you. And so I took that to heart as I went through the process. And so what I'm going to do here today is really share with you that research approach, the context. I'm going to spend some time on the role of theory. Although I was advised not to, I really want us to really dissect the role of theory, especially in your own work, but also in the role that it plays in this current societal climate, this political climate, and how do you use academia and research as a tool to really speak to the nuances of historically marginalized communities. I'm going to speak about my experience with theory. I thought I didn't like theory, and in the process I became a theorist. And in that process, I created my own lens because I felt that the theories that were available to us were not applicable to the communities I wanted to really support. And so I'll talk about that process. I will give you a synopsis of those key findings, but I think most importantly, when I talk about recommendations, broadly speaking of my research, it's not really talking about academic or academia recommendations. I'm really taking this standpoint to provide recommendations to all of you as scholars, current scholars, and future scholars that are going to contribute to the fields of all your fields, respectively. And as I mentioned, in conclusion, I will end with a poem that was recently published when I talked about what is the role of community colleges as a way to really support baccalaureate attainment for students of color in the state. So just to give you some context, what led me to this work? As I mentioned, I held a question that was really based on my own personal experiences. And Carlos Torres, here a faculty at the School of Education, when I took graduate courses in undergrad, he said, if you really look at scholarship, if you really look at theory, if you scratch the surface of it, you really find it's someone's own experience. Just try to make sense of one's experience. And so in this context, I really wanted to understand, again, the role of education as a social system of really, in my case, my theory was the way that we are tracking or marginalizing folks in our society. So national context. How many of you, by applause, because we're recording this, by applause, how many of you have seen this data in the past? And so what this really tells us, it gives us a national portrait of how is education really supporting our various communities in attaining their formal education. There's a difference between formal education as we say, educados, and then that of being informally, socially, the way you grew up. But this particular diagram really shows the way that students are maneuvered through the educational system. And the important role of my work, specifically in other scholars, is to really talk about the nuances among and between the various communities of color. So if we were to take the far, your left, my right, or vice versa, the green bars, right? If we were to start with the 100 Latino students, what happens to them as they go through the educational system? So the number on the first number represents females and the second represents males. So technically 200. So, but if we were to start with the 100 Latinas, 63 graduated from high school, 13 obtained a baccalaureate degree, 4 of them obtained a master's degree or graduate degree, and 0.3, so less than 1%, actually obtained a PhD. If we see across the bottom, we see that Latinos are the most disproportionately impacted communities in obtaining their PhD. And so the question becomes, why the PhD? Why the focus on a PhD, and why is this important? The real importance here is that the PhD in this particular society, and people would argue across the world, if you obtain a PhD, you are there a scholar, you're producing new knowledge. The process of going through a PhD is that you're going to really understand theoretical concepts to understand a certain phenomena. Very few of us get to experience that type of training. And so my question was, why? Why is it that very few folks of color generally are not accessing this level of academic training? But this is just one figure to talk about disparities. The second one that I utilized is really understanding the phenomena of students who go on to a community college. The former figure didn't include any discourse or opportunity for us to really engage in that particular process. We simply looked from kindergarten to the PhD, and that's it. Very linear. But we understand that not everyone goes through that process in a very linear or sequential way. This particular figure then really takes into account what happens to students who start at the community college. So this is an example of one particular community looking at Latinos and Latinas starting at the elementary school level and following the same format. 46 graduate from high school, 26 go on to college, but of those 26, the majority, 17 of them, started at the community college. The other 9 went directly to a 4-year institution. However, what's more important here is that of those 17 who started at the community college, only 1 transfers to a 4-year institution. So of that 1 transfer and the 9 that originally started at the 4-year, that's 10, of those 10, only 8 eventually obtain a bachelor's degree. So we already lost 2 of the students. So every point of the educational trajectory here, my question was always, why? What's happening and why are we losing the majority of our students? And then the pipeline to conclude this is 2 of them receive a graduate degree, and again, less than 1 receive a doctorate. And so my question again was begging to understand, what are we as institutions doing to retain our students? Or what are we doing that's causing them to leave the process? And so oftentimes when I delved into the literature, I would find deficit explanations of why students would leave the system, such as they don't value education, their families don't value education, or they're too busy with having to balance work and school and they prefer work. And to me, it was always pinpointing our students as blaming them for not being able to complete their education. So I knew there was something inherently wrong with those phenomena or those explanations of the phenomena. And so I knew that the theoretical frameworks available to us were not adequate. Further along, when I did a case study analysis as to of those students who eventually do transfer to a 4-year institution, where are they going? So this particular case study of a district in Southern California really told me another story. What we have here is that for this particular case study, we are often transferring our Asian students to a UC system. We're transferring our African American students to private institutions. We're transferring our Latino students to Cal State system, and our white students to private institutions. So then my question began to try to investigate, are we tracking our community college students? And if we're tracking our community college students to, for example, my focus is Latino students, if we're tracking Latino students to the CSU, are they obtaining the skill set and knowledge that will prepare them to pursue a PhD? Because the PhD are not offered at the Cal State system. They're only offered at the UC system and private institutions. So are we systematically oppressing and really tracking our Latino students to not be ready to enter a PhD? So all of these questions I get were really trying to understand the transfer experience and how many of them are actually gaining the opportunity to be ready to enter this type of training. Further along, again, another piece of data that spoke to me greatly was this notion of how are we preparing, community colleges preparing our students to go on to transfer institutions or foreign institutions. And so what we have here is the goal. This is a new data point. The new chancellor of the California Community College System, Chancellor Oakley, presented this as the targeted metric for our regions to transfer our students. And so the targeted goal is at least a 46% of our students to be transferred across the state. So that's really represented by that circle around the different colored circles. So the further away you are from that outer layer, that means that these regions are historically and are perpetually marginalized and not preparing our students. So what you see here is a pattern. You have folks up in the northern California tip most of the state. You have central region and the Inland Empire that continue to be marginalized, and they're not preparing our students to go on to a four-year institution. So I went back to that question as to why. Why is this happening, and are we further marginalizing students who have been marginalized for the last 40 years? Because to me, that doesn't make any sense. So how can I use my positionality as an academic to really have these questions at the forefront of all of my queries and dialogue? Now, although these data seem deficit, right? They're negative, they're like, oh, again. Because every time I present these data, I have folks in the audience say, but we know this already, this is overwhelming. And I don't want it to be dismissed, because the end point of the conversation I started was what happens to those who eventually do obtain a PhD. So as a doctoral student, I analyzed a national data set. It's the Survey of Earned Doctorates. That survey, everybody who receives a PhD in this country has to complete the survey, otherwise they don't get their degree. So it's a universal data set. We don't miss anybody. So once obtaining that data set, my question was, how many of those who received a PhD started at the community college? That question had never been asked. Part of it is because we didn't collect that information up until we started collecting that data in 1990. So then my question is, between 1990 and 2000, how many folks who received a PhD started at the community college? The answer was 10%. 1 out of 10 PhD scholars started at the community college. That itself was phenomenal, because this clearly states that community college play an incredible role of supporting our students to not only transfer, but potentially pursue a PhD. But what's more interesting and more compelling is once you start disaggregating that data by race and ethnicity, we see that for specifically my interest in my study is for Chicanas and Chicanos, Mexican-American scholars, 24% who obtained a PhD started at the community college. So that means that 1 out of 4 Chicano PhDs started their post-secondary education at the community college. So with that data, again, this is all numbers. At that point, I asked, what happened? And if they were able to do it, how can we replicate that? Because whatever they went through, they obviously were resilient to not only enter the community college, successfully transfer onto a four-year institution, successfully obtain a graduate degree, and successfully get that PhD. So whatever they went through, whatever they encountered, we need to know. So my dissertation, as I was talking to David offline, it was the first dissertation to ask that question. What is the transfer experience through the entire post-secondary pipeline? Because back when I started that PhD, my question really was a visionary question. It was if we are able to really support a pathway and clear out all the barriers, then we're really going to shift that California master plan. And we're really going to support our students who needed most. So my guiding question specifically for my dissertation was really one major overarching question. The first one was, what is the Chicana community college transfer experience en route to the doctorate? I had to make that connection. Because all the literature I read, it was simply talking about community college students at the community college, and very few, at most 4, studies who really focused on the transfer experience at the 4-year institution. I wanted to take that further. I wanted to understand what happened to them while at the community college, in the transfer function, at the 4-year, preparing to graduate school, and in graduate school. I wanted to know it all. So the purposeful questions, right, the overarching was the entire process, but I wanted specifically to understand what happened to them at the 4-year, what happened to them while they prepared to graduate school, and what happened to them essentially through their graduate school preparation and aspirations, and what did they do specifically? What did the women do themselves as they navigated their educational journey? Now, the thing about these questions were the responsibility that we all have collectively as scholars is to really understand theory. What is the role of theory? And specifically, the role of theory in dominant ideologies. Because, let me take a quick assessment of who's in the room. How many of you are current community college students? At the community college. Okay, community college transfer students at the 4-year. Okay, mentors, faculty, parents, padres familiares. We're all important in this conversation. But the reason I ask this is because we also have to understand how theory works and where it came from. And so while we here at UCLA, we take pride in those 4 beautiful buildings just a few steps away, Royce and Powell Library, and the 4 first buildings that were built and created this institution. As an undergraduate student, I often would stand in that quad, take a look around it, and realize these institutions were made by my folks, by brown, black folks, but they were not made intended for me to be in it. And so we have to understand that these institutions were and still function as historical white institutions. So what I was reading, all these theories and studies and frameworks that were often couching students of color as a deficit, stem from that ideology. So again, our role is to then understand that history and understand that as scholars with new perspectives, new ways of knowing, we often have to challenge some of those theories. And we have to be prepared to do just that. For my particular agenda, I knew I had to be bold and unapologetic as to what I was going to research. I employed critical race theory. Now, critical race theory has since I employed it back a while ago, it's become this, what I would say, a catchphrase. It's like critical race theory here, critical race theory there. I observe students present their work. I observe my own colleagues present their work. They oftentimes just do this. They throw up the 5 major tenets of critical race theory and assume the audience is going to know what that means, right? These are the 5 primary elements. We have to centralize and really talk about race and racism in our institutions and how that carries out in our research. CRT also challenges the dominant ideology. It has a bold commitment to social and racial justice. It centralizes experiential knowledge, meaning the student experience is very important to the way we do our work. And has interdisciplinary approach, meaning although I'm in the field of education, I also have a responsibility to look at sociology, ethnic studies, women's studies, and other fields to really understand the phenomena. So I'm sharing this process because I'm also taking this opportunity to guide you in your own work as well and ask you not to do this. Don't just throw out the tenets of a theory and say, this is what I'm going to do. You have to really show us how theories are informing your work. So for example, a CRT-driven questions, how is this lens? Because theory is really what I would say, you're putting on glasses, you're putting on lenses, you're helping us explain how you see the world and how you see a certain phenomena. So for my particular research, the CRT-driven question asked, how do the discourses, expectations, processes, and structures within community colleges, four-year institutions, and graduate school help to sustain racial, ethnic, gender, and class discrimination in a transfer student's attempt to pursue a doctorate degree. Another example would be, specifically to the population that I was documenting here, is how do Chicana students resist the educational discourses, expectations, processes, and structures that help maintain all of these forms of discrimination in their attempt to transfer and attain a doctorate degree. So what does that mean for us as scholars is that you are then redefining that theoretical framework. You're borrowing from that theory and you're giving it a new definition. So that definition for my particular work, I noted, critical race theory is an explanatory framework that accounts for the role of race and racism in post-secondary institutions that works towards identifying, understanding, and challenging racism as part of a larger goal of identifying and challenging all forms of subordination as one attempts to obtain a doctorate degree. So again, you're redefining this theory. I borrowed it, I saw it as a good lens for me to start, but I then have to add elements that would be very directly applicable to my research study. But the important thing about doing your own work is that you get to choose whether you stay with one theory or you use a number of theories that really form your lenses. I chose to also use Dolores de Bernard's work on Chicana feminist epistemology. And again, I could put up the four major tenets that she prescribed in terms of what this really means, but the role of my responsibility as an academic is to give you that definition. And it's a long one, because there's a long history with this. A Chicana feminist epistemology, it really takes into account that we're going to resist quote-unquote traditional methodologies and theories that often distort or omit the Chicana experience and knowledge altogether. Chicana scholars or researchers bring a cultural intuition to the research process that oftentimes institutions often oppress. A Chicana feminist epistemology constructs appropriate protocols to incorporate and investigate critical data, because the way data in the past was collected often was not friendly or sensitive to the experiences of low-income, first-generation college students. And the most important thing here is that research is grounded on the life experiences of Chicanas. And all, at the end of the day, they are epistemological experts. Epistemology is a way of knowing. And again, through the research process, we're able to document what those experiences are. That wasn't enough for me. Critical race theory was great. It gave me a way to redefine a theory. Chicana feminist epistemology gave me the opportunity and permission to say, I have knowledge that has not been acknowledged by this institution, and I want to be able to document that. So I proposed a Chicana critical feminist praxis. What does this all mean? It means that first, we have to acknowledge that this stems from a history of Chicana feminisms and Chicana literature. A Chicana feminist critical praxis is an explanatory framework which accounts for the researcher and participant's embodiment of multiple forms of knowing through the experience of racism, classism, sexism, and ageism in post-secondary institutions. Secondly, Chicana feminist critical praxis works to identify, further understand, and challenge multiple forms of subordination as one practices research by redefining and renegotiating theories and methods to produce new knowledge in academia. And lastly, this knowledge production must find its applicability in practice articulated with and among multiple communities, especially the next generation of scholars. Because oftentimes, as PhDs, we're told that what you're going to do is go on to a tenure-track position. You're going to continue teaching and professing. You're going to profess everything you learn. But that's often limited, because we know, based on the data I showed at the beginning, folks that enter that realm are very limited, and it's not folks that look like me. So I wanted to make sure that the work I produce was going to be available to those who are going through the process. And so I made sure that I did not go to a tenure track faculty position, that I would find and fight again 15 years in the process to get into the community college sector. So I wanted to make sure this scholarship was available to community college students. And so that's one deviation of what's expected of an academic. But going back to the purpose of this presentation is to really give you a synopsis of how I not only redefined theory, created a new lens, but how did this help me understand the experiences of those Chicana students who were gaining a PhD? So quick synopsis of my doctoral study. It was a case study of UCLA doctoral students. Why UCLA? Because UCLA is the top #1 institution who produces PhD from marginalized communities. African American, Asian American, Chicanas especially, come from UCLA. So with the data led me to the case study naturally. So all UCLA doctoral students, they were in the fields of education, women's studies, sociology, world arts and culture. This was back in 2005 and 6 when I collected data. All of these women began their post-secondary education in the community college sector. I actually worked, and I say collaborating, with eight mujeres who identified as Chicana, Mexican American, or Mexicanas. I employed a new method called testimonios as pláticas. So what is testimonios as pláticas versus the conventional way of what we talk about interviews or focus groups? Testimonios really talk about the opportunity to invoke oral histories. We really want to understand that we shouldn't go into a space with a scripted interview and simply go 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D. Very scripted, very, what's a good word I could use? Very rigid. And I knew that was not going to work. I was open to really having a full conversation, a plática, allowing our participants and collaborators to free flow in terms of how they wanted to recollect their own trajectory. So, and then at the end of the day, these testimonios, these pláticas were in-depth reflections and recollection of their educational journey, which at the end of the process yield 50 hours of these pláticas. So for those of you who are engaged in qualitative methods, you know that for every 1 hour of interview is really 3 or 4 hours of transcription. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but I think at the end of the day, it really sets the foundation to say this is what really the women are sharing and what we can take away to understand what that experience looks like. So the in-depth reflection, initially I wanted to talk, as I mentioned earlier, really wanted to understand the experiences at the community college as they transferred and en route to the PhD. But through the pláticas, the women really started talking about how their educational trajectory was really rooted in their upbringing. So at the end of the day, the data spoke to their experiences at the high school, and their high school experience to the community college, and then thereafter community college to the 4-year transfer experience in graduate school. But what about this pláticas? Why is this important? And I write poetry, as I mentioned, throughout my dissertation, and so I share this here. You know, the purpose of implementing testimonios to pláticas was for the mujeres to share, detail, critique, and be open, honest, vulnerable, raw, uncensored, about their recollection as they found appropriate, as they wished, as they recalled in their terms and in their words. So throughout these pláticas, they were very critical, and they would call out racist encounters and would say, that was racism, that was classism, this is what I experienced. One of the women was undocumented, so the multiple layers of experience, she was able to reflect and call it out for what it was. My role as a researcher was to document what she was critiquing and theorizing. Because as Shari Moraga and Gloria Sandua often remind us, is that Chicanas, we theorize in the flesh. We embody this knowledge, and so it's my role, our role as researchers, to document what these particular individuals were sharing with us. And so I know I will be mindful of our time. Again, in terms of these pláticas, they lend themselves to really have a fruitful conversation and understanding of their experiences. So some of the key findings, and while I wrote 220 pages of incredible resiliency, I list here some of these key findings, and I really just present 2 of the 5 findings. So the first one is really this overarching, what I call transfer obstructive institutional barriers. So this is really talking about the experiences of Chicanas at the 4-year institution. And so what I call is that this was really beyond the transfer shock, because there is literature to suggest that students go through this shock of going from a semester system to a quarter system. So it's really just that's been documented in terms of what transfer students go through. So in my literature, in my research, I said it's more than just that. There's a cultural shock. There's an epistemological shock. And so we need to make sure that we name it for what it is. So some of these elements of, again, beyond the transfer shock, is issues as what I call transferism. The blatant disregard of transfer students, because often they said, other people, faculty, peers, other folks would tell them, you're lucky you are here as a transfer student. Another form of racism is they would often hear, affirmative action is still real, that's why you're here. Classism. Comments such as, come on, you seriously can't go out to eat? The answer was no. We can't go out to eat. We don't have that money. Ageism, for example. The women would hear comments such as, I was already in graduate school at your age. So that meant that some of our students were older and they had to deal with these issues and these comments by other folks. The women talked about languageism, what we really call in academic jargon is linguistic profiling. So some of the women would receive comments by their peers saying, stop being so ghetto and use proper terminology. And that really stemmed from this need of having to have these really elongated terms to express themselves when the women really just wanted to get to the point. And were honest about their experience as transfer students, but they would hear this pushback of saying, well, we don't want to hear what you have to say until you actually learn how to speak our way. They also encounter faculty transfer deficit perspectives. Faculty themselves would dismiss them as transfer students and would tell them, I'm just doing you a favor because you are a transfer student. So I'll work with you. I'll give you extra credit, maybe. And so this notion of really experiencing more than just the academic semester to transfer change, it was really talking about how do we tease out these additional elements of the transfer experience once at the 4-year. Because they're telling us what they're experiencing, but my responsibility is how do I recommend the institution to actually listen to what they're telling us? How do we train our faculty to really understand what the transfer experience is like? How do we engage other students so they understand that no one's doing anyone any favor? Everyone's here because they deserve to be here. And so those are the types of questions that really stem from some of these findings. The counterpart to this is that they also found transfer supportive institutional factors. What we call the transfer receptive programs. Dimple Jane here at the School of Education really started working on this transfer receptive at the 4-year institution. What are 4-year institutions doing to welcome and really help transition the community college transfer students to ensure that they create a transfer community at this particular campus? Faculty of color were especially important, especially female faculty of color, because they themselves would make themselves available and the women felt that they were genuine in their approach and they weren't doing them any favors. In fact, they felt that female faculty of color were going beyond what's really required of faculty to really mentor them and challenge them academically to ensure that they had the skill set and training to move on to the next phase. They also created their own, what we call the Chicana transfer epistemology. They're transferistas. They created their own community to make sure that they felt supported, and they felt that this was only available among other transfer students that really understood their experiences. And the fourth critical element of their transfer experience at the 4-year was to be connected to their family. Their familial epistemic consejos. Consejos that maybe were not stemming from having gone through the 4-year or higher education in this particular country, but it came from dedication, work ethic, commitment, and knowing very well that their sacrifices, both their families and their own sacrifices, would pay off in the long run. And so in this context, I talk about in learning these experiences of these women, both the positive and the not so positive, how do I start naming these experiences? And so in my own title, I use the term soulfully resistant transferistas. And as my faculty advisor, Dr. Tolorosano, said, whenever you use any term as a researcher, you have to take responsibility as to why it is that you're using it. So as my final stages of the dissertation, he would not approve it until I would have language in the dissertation to really define why I chose the word soulfully. And I struggled. It came to me intuitively, that word really spoke to me. And I wanted to make sure that I wrote about what that meant. And the only way that came to me was through poem. And so I will read that to you now. As a researcher, I hold the responsibility to find an appropriate defining term beyond a simple adjective to describe how the mujeres maintain their focus, motivation, and resistance through their entire post-secondary education as transfer students. So I sought a term to encapsulate their dedication to their family, especially their parents, their community, especially future generations of students of color, mujeres de color, and to themselves. I sought a term to condense las energías they transferred in our pláticas through testimonios as they, I'm sure, transmitted to those who crossed their path, fought their presence, questioned their ability, faced their perspective, witnessed their resistance, and eventually embraced their aspirations. Through this, all of this, the mujeres felt they navigated against the current, siempre contra la corriente, barrier after barrier after barrier after one another, solely for being systematically pushed, stigmatized, affiliated to the supposed bottom sector of the community college system. I sought a term that could summarize the resistance, determination, perseverance, fortaleza, y fuerza. I sought a term that had not been used to describe community college transfer students, particularly transfer students of color, and especially transfer mujeres de color. A term that had not been used mainly because there hasn't been enough research to document the racism, classism, and multiple isms that community college students y mujeres experience. I sought a term, then felt the need and pressure to define, describe, and own the term according to my advising faculty y mi propia facultad. I sought a term, soon realizing the concept, the energy was there all along, within, through their testimonios. The ocho mujeres humbly allowed me to experience and witness retrospectively intimate details about their experience, their transfer experience, experiences too often silenced, too often marginalized, or omitted altogether. I sought a term, and it is soulfully right. I thank las ocho mujeres for reminding me and the readers how profound their commitment, their willingness, and vision lies within, because soulfully resistant, committed to themselves, for themselves, because often the belief in themselves is all they had to get them through and make it through. That's precisely why I titled my dissertation Soulfully Resistant Transferistas. And so when we turn to talk about your findings, really supporting your implications, I could bring the implications I proposed in my dissertation, but I wanted to take the opportunity to really talk about how this research is really providing implications for scholars like yourself. I think the beauty of this particular plenary is that my work ultimately comes full circle. The main recommendation of my dissertation was to have programs such as these. The fact that we would start talking about our community college students as doctoral scholars, to have programs that would support you to understand what research means, so by the time you transfer, you already have experience under your belt regarding the research process, and that you're not like some of the women in the study or some of my personal experience of being in a research institution and not knowing exactly what that means. So having programs like CC2 PhD is really one of my biggest recommendations for our institutions, is how do we start talking about graduate school with all of our students, especially current community college students. So the implications I will share here today with you are really about your work as community college students, future transfer students, current transfer students. The implications regarding research is that oftentimes our research really calls for a paradigm shift. If you haven't read Michael Kuhn's Paradigm Shift, I recommend you do. That was a book I read right before I started the PhD program. So I knew exactly what I was going to be doing for the 10 years that it took me to get that PhD. And so Paradigm Shift is really calling out those theories that continue to oppress our communities. You have to be unapologetic about what it is you're researching and making sure that as a PhD recipient, You're making not only waves of change in your scholarship, but you're making waves of change in this world. Be unapologetic and be transfer-centered, period. No need to have to convince folks anymore. This is the way we have to do this. We have to make sure our students are not only accessing the four-year institution, but they're being trained as early as possible to become PhD scholars. The interdisciplinary nature of this work is incredibly important, especially because of the political climate that we're living. We need to be able to bridge history to our present reality and make sure that history does not repeat itself. We have to challenge the dominant cultural shifts, and I'll talk about what that means, particularly when we hear about these new initiatives and new catchphrases that are just covert ways of continuing to repress students of color. And at the end of the day, what this calls for really is that your perspective as community college transfer students is new. Because we saw the data. We still need to make sure that we increase the capacity to embrace your perspective. So this is what we call a call for research activism. In terms of institutional implications, we have to be cognizant. You have to hold folks accountable. Faculty, administrators, instructors, staff. We have to be cognizant of what we call these new initiatives, this new wave of what we call student equity and student success. And I'll problematize what that means in a minute. We have to be, as I mentioned, cognizant of these new catchphrases, because 20 years ago we were using the words at-risk students, right? And then we transitioned to remedial students, and then we talked about developmental students, and so now we're talking about disproportionately impacted students. So we have to be cognizant as to what that means and the psychology of what those terms really mean. So I'll end my presentation here today with a poem that was recently published. I responded to Chancellor Oakley's challenge. He said he wants to double the number of students who transfer to four-year institution, which in theory sounds great. I would say in theory it sounds great of a new chancellor coming in and saying we're going to double our number of transfer students, but I actually want to see the active proportion of what that means. So in response to his leadership, I submitted an article and a poem. The Association of Mexican American Educator Journals put a new edition out in December, and the title was Latinx in the Community College, Promoting Pathways to Post-Secondary Degrees. So my response to this commitment of increasing transfer is the fact that we still live in real tragic times, unfortunately. And so the poem is called A Real Tragedy. And so it's really just giving us language to be able to have those conversations. If we're fully committed to transfer our students, what does that look like? If we're fully committed to transfer our students and make sure they have the skills and knowledge to become doctoral students, what does that look like? And so this is the final poem. We often assume, and we know what that means, right? We assume. When we continue to name oppressive experiences faced by Latino students or students of color in community colleges, we are shut down as these are things of the past. After all, Latinos are the largest growing minority. We have studies dating back 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We assume. We assume we know the challenges. We assume we know the barriers. Yet, as an activist scholar administrator in this field, this shit is still real. Too damn real not to name it, así que, when we shame our students for not knowing, not naming, nor having the terminology to name what they aspire to do at the community college, it assumes. It assumes that we do a job, or that we do a really good job, or that we simply do a job of explaining the purpose of a three-tier public college system. And that's a real tragedy. Because some folks working in the system are so removed, disconnected, they've forgotten, or pretend they don't know, or they don't care to know, nor care to know the realities experienced in our communities, nor the historical underpinnings, white supremacist underpinnings that built educational institutions in this country, and that's a real tragedy. Instead, they lash out to say, how dare we speak? Don't speak, not us, how dare we speak? How dare we speak about graduate school, or medical school, or law school, or anything to challenge and change the status quo? How dare we speak to community college students about these things? These students they're not gonna make it that far, right? Yet we know, and we see, we hear, we feel, we know the truth, and we know our strength, and we know their strength. We know their resilience. When 1 out of 4 Chicanos and Chicanas PhD scholars produced between 1990 and 2000 for the entire country started at the community college. We know our strength, we know the power they be. When you have to convince folks our students are resilient, determined, beautiful, and committed to their education, their families, and themselves, we have to convince folks hard because their lenses are fogged, están tapados, with deficit ideologies continuing to brainwash folks to believe and exacerbate the opposite, and that's a real tragedy. When we refuse to call it white supremacy or racism or classism or misogyny or ageism because, well, we may not have the language to name it, or because we are too damn comfortable with our 6-figure paychecks, and that's a real tragedy. When our students' parents may not know what college is about, instead of stepping in to engage them, we stand quick to point fingers and blame them, and that's a real tragedy. Because 60 years in the process, we finally realize we've been marginalizing, shackling, oppressing, and neglecting too many, and overwhelming many of our students in not transferring, and not accessing the right courses, in complicating the process, or misplacing them in mismatched courses, relegating and correlating in remedial courses, and that's a real tragedy. Because see, now it's time for student equity. We talk about it, we plan for it, we meet to talk and plan, we plan to talk and meet. But folks bluff to understand equity. Why would we need a special initiative? Special initiative, everyone listen up, because there's tons of money there. So listen up, plan to meet to plan, but nowhere is there assurance folks know what equity means, and that's a real tragedy. When we speak of equity, we speak up, we conjure, we evoke, we recall, we remember the legacies of struggle, legacies of exclusion, legacies of sacrifices generations after generations after generations have before endured. That is pedagogy of memory, that is pedagogy of hope. You see, equity does not equate diversity, and I'll repeat. Equity does not equate diversity. We do not pause to plan, to celebrate who is in the room. We have to pause to see, to fight, to voice, to name, to acknowledge who is fighting to be in the room. Because this here is legacies of exclusion, legacies of a 3-tiered system, legacies of a continued marginalization, legacies of correlating students of color in the perceived bottom sector of higher education, and that's a real tragedy. But the real tragedy is in knowing folks will read this in disagreement, because then they too are part of this tragedy. Y si les queda el saco, ya saben. The beauty in this is knowing our students resist. They have, they will, and we must together. There are critical folks that have been there this entire time, voicing, pushing, encouraging, challenging, not often heard, often silenced, ignored, oppressed, released, or they resign. Killed in their attempt to defend our students, and that's a real tragedy. But just as they've quarreled and relegated to oppress, students fight back. We will the challenge, we will create systemic changes, rooted in community, nurtured within our own legacies, centered on advocacy and resiliency, along with our students, because of our students, and because of our communities, because of the generations after generations of teaching and inculcating resilience. We've been ready. We've been ready to name and confront all the multiple isms in our theories, in our scholarship, because ahorita no hay de otra. Simply because we cannot afford to accept another tragedy, and this here is our collective tragedy. So, that poem was included as a response to that expectation of transferring our students. But the reality is that we're still fighting deficit ideologies amongst our colleges. And so our role here as scholars is to be able to name them, document them, and really improve on how we're going to systematically change that process. So I thank you for your time. Again, this is full circle, having been in this field for quite some time, and having had the experience of really talking about the Latino experience specifically, but the transfer experience generally, in all of our pathways. This is one of few studies. And again, the role that we have as sociologists, as scholarship in education or whatever field you are, is how do we make sure that we are speaking truth to the experiences of our students, and how do we make sure that holding those degrees will enable us to strengthen our society. So I thank you for your time, and I know we have about 15 minutes or so to engage in any questions you may have of me.
Yeah, on the slide that it showed that 24% or a quarter of all PhD are coming from the JCs. Was there any studies done as to interview those individuals as to what their personal backgrounds were?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. I mean, I started with really understanding the experiences of women wanting to get into that PhD program. But in terms of a retrospective of PhD scholars, that would be another study.
First of all, thank you. That was a really, really amazing and inspiring presentation. I was wondering if you faced any backlash at all at your work, and could you describe that experience?
My current work?
No, your work. Sure, yeah, all of it.
So actually, I'll give you a formal more introduction of who I am. So as of May 24th, this past Thursday, that was my last day. I resigned from being a Dean of Institutional Effectiveness at a community college. So it took me about 15 years to get there. But once there, this is the agenda I brought forth in terms of what we need to do to ensure that we are supporting our students, and that when we see classism or any forms of marginalization, that we name it. Unfortunately, that institution was not ready for someone like myself, and so they weren't able to retain me. But in terms of my work generally, I have not received any backlash. And I think part of that is if someone were to present a negative backlash, I would be ready to defend this work. And that's the work as an academic, is that you do all your background checks. When someone would say, oh, don't use CRT, use this theory or that theory, I was quick to say, well, I know that theory too well, and I know it was based on white men, and I'm not going to use that for my study. So you have to do that background training. That's what the doctoral training does, is you have to be exposed to the various theories, various works, various methods and designs, and for you to be versed to say, this is why I'm not going to tolerate any backlash. Anybody else? Yes.
I was just going to ask the question she asked about being a scholar is easy to write about social justice, but as a practitioner, as a student of first practitioner, how was it advocating for equity? I think you answered it.
Well, I think part of the challenge I mentioned in the poetry is that a lot of folks don't really understand what equity means. I think oftentimes right now, presently, because there's this movement, both not only at the community college, but at the CSU and UC, is this whole wave of student success, right? We have to focus on student success. And the reality is that if we keep that psychology of language, is if the students don't succeed, that's them, right? Something's wrong there. My take would say, instead of really looking at student success, let's really talk about institutional neglect. Because when we really look at the transfer process, and I took down the notes in terms of it takes, 4% of our students transfer within 2 years, 60% transfer within 4 years, and about 36% transfer within 6 years. So we often use that data to talk about those who were able to actually transfer. But what we're not doing is saying that 70% of our students were not supported to transfer. So now we're really shifting the discourse to talk about the institutions and ability to support students to transfer. So it's a two-pronged approach. It's one, you need to know your theory, you need to know your literature, you need to know your data. Because if somebody comes at me saying, well, let's talk about equity, my pushback would be, well, how do you define equity? Because oftentimes right now, this whole issue of equity is really co-opted by this diversity, multicultural issue, right? Let's talk about diversity, and that's not what equity means. What equity really means is that we've been historically suppressing certain communities from accessing these opportunities. The mic just went off, maybe that's bad. But, so that's really, it's like, how do you then have that conversation? Because again, if we stay at the surface level, we're not gonna get to the deep, real deep, institutionalized ways of oppressing and not really supporting our students. And that's really the challenge I had as a practitioner. Not necessarily because I was an academic, as I still had to deal with issues of I'm young, I'm brown, I'm a woman, so I had to deal with those layers for people to really see me as an academic. But then really having those conversations that are guided by data and guided by the literature. And unfortunately, the reality is that many practitioners don't want to use that literature, or they don't want to use that data. They just simply want to be comfortable with business as usual. And I think that's the challenge. And that's not just one particular campus, it's systemic. It's a sector that really needs to really step up in terms of really understanding what they're naming, what they're practicing, and how they're utilizing data to support their efforts.
And my second question is, I'm kind of ambivalent to getting a PhD. It took me about 10 years to transfer to UC Berkeley because I used to be informally undocumented, and I took a class with your colleague, Crystal Alvarez. We took a chemistry class together before she transferred to UCLA as a sociology major. And I know Lindsay Perez, she wanted to become a professor at UC Berkeley, but she didn't get selected. So my question is, Crystal had a hard time getting a job. She worked at Cal Poly for a while as a gender and women's studies. But I was wondering, why is it so difficult for females, colored females, to attain? I mean, it's difficult to get a PhD, as you're talking about, but once they get there, it's also hard to navigate the job market.
Well, I think it's beyond the navigating the job market. It's really going back to my premise that these are white institutions we're dealing with. And so while we're not selected to be faculty because we bring a certain agenda that really holds institutions accountable to what they're doing, the truth is that Lindsay Perez, Dr. Perez, is a faculty member at Cal State Long Beach. Unfortunately, Crystal Alvarez passed away. And I think part of it, she was one of my best friends. And so I would say that really academia took her from us 36 years too young. And that's another lecture. But I think the reality is it's really the fact that very few folks are entering this level of training. Folks come in with a certain agenda, and if you don't have the right supportive advising faculty, colleagues to really say, don't let go of your agenda, that's gonna weed you out. And so that really speaks to another process of graduate school aspirations and really finding an institution that's gonna be a good fit for you, and then really thinking about how you're going to use that PhD. Because I problematized that too, right? I said, just because you have a PhD does not mean you have to go directly to a tenure-track faculty position. It's really about how you're going to transfer those skill sets and knowledge to make sure that you're supporting communities, period. So it doesn't have to be as a faculty, it could be as a practitioner, as an administrator. It could be, I've been a federal agent at the U.S. Department of Commerce, I've been an executive manager at a nonprofit agency. But every position I've held was purposeful. Was how do I understand and really obtain a skill set that's transferable to make sure I continue to advocate for transfer students. So it's really about how do you then find the right mentor to guide you through those questions. But again, my quick answer would be it's simply because we are still relegated to these white institutions are having a difficult time really embracing a new set of lenses. And it's still a work in progress.
Hola, Doctora Rivas. I wanted to ask, how do, as students, how can we implement these programs or push to implement these programs and become, leaders in our schools?
Well, I mean, for one, as I mentioned, this program itself is a CC2 PhD. I quickly asked David, how did this come about? Because again, as a graduate student here, we would have brainstorming sessions with Dr. Solorzano, with Dr. Macias out in Chicana Studies, with Chono Riega at Chicano Studies Research Center. How do we make sure these spaces are available? How are we making sure that we're pulling faculty in to hold them accountable to make sure that they understand the transfer experience and they're mentoring our transfer students equally as any other student, right? Because you all deserve to be here in these institutions. And the question was always, the answer was always, well, we don't have the resources. We don't have the resources. But folks like David have found ways to be able to institutionalize programs such as these. So your role as students is to take these programs seriously. So when there is an evaluation, you complete that evaluation. If there's a submission, a call for submission, you submit. If you have to present, you present. It's really taking this opportunity seriously because they've been long-term coming and they weren't here 10 years ago when I was still a graduate student. They weren't here. We were still trying to advocate, like, this is important. Do we not see the connections? If we don't support our students to become doctoral scholars, we're gonna miss the boat. And part of it is even now as we speak, if we were to push the pause button on the students who are at the CSU and UC and private institutions right now as we speak, May 26, 2018, if we push the pause button, we're not going to produce the baccalaureate, educated, trained workforce we need in this state and in this country, let alone graduate degrees. So what happens there? So that's why we have the student success initiatives, that's why we have the student equity, initiatives focused on transfer students. Everyone right now is running around crazy. Like, what do we do with transfer students? How do we make sure we increase transfer students? How do we make sure we minimize the time they're at the community college? But we've had scholarship that dates 15 years ago. But now we're all of a sudden trying to figure it out. And my challenge with these new initiatives is that if we let 2 or 3 cycles of these new initiatives to go forward and we don't get it right, we've neglected an entire generation of scholars. And so we have to think about, what do these initiatives mean? What are we really doing? Are we bluffing? Are we just calling it equity? Are we just calling it student success but not really doing anything about it? So for students, I'd say if there is opportunities such as these, take them seriously, because they haven't been here for long, and we want to make sure they are going to stay here long. So David would need data to say this is effective and this is how it's effective. And so we want to make sure that that you stay committed to that process as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment. As an Indigenous woman, it's really hard to find, role models, and I really thank you for doing this research, and you've gone through so much and staying strong, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. How have you seen the schools change their role with your program, or the way you think versus how they used to think before? And have they been embracing, or have they just really gone after you?
Well, the thing is that, it took a while for me to simply own my voice. A part of it was because I was a 22-year-old at a PhD program, and I had faculty here who would tell me, like, you don't belong in a PhD program, you're too young, you don't have much to offer. But yet, a year after, when they realized I was in it for the long haul and I was committed to getting this PhD, that's when they started backing off. And so I think that experience is relevant in any space I've been in, is that I don't let go of my agenda. I know what the data suggests. I know that what our students are voicing that they need. And so ultimately, I see myself as a mediator. I'm teaching administration how to listen to our students, because they've forgotten how to do that. And so, although I said I resigned because it was a toxic environment. But ultimately, it's because I knew that whatever I say, they're not going to do anything about it. And so it's sort of, I'm taking on a whole system, and that's unfair, right? Like I mentioned, some of my colleagues have been ill, one died, and those are real experiences. We could list critical scholars who have unfortunately sacrificed their lives trying to do this work. One of the prominent scholars and writers for me that have influenced my writing has been Gloria Anzaldúa to this date. And she died trying to get her PhD. So in the field of experiencing or going through the doctoral process, there's this concept called racial battle fatigue, right? It's you're constantly bombarded with something, name it. And oftentimes we know how to name it and call it out, and then when we don't, we embody it, and we take it with us until it starts hurting our bodies physically. Being a dean, I'll be brutally honest with you, I've gained like 40 pounds. Physically, I've gained 40 pounds just being in that institution. And it's because of all these nuances. And that's okay, because I'm able to name it, call it out, and hold folks accountable for it. And that's part of my trajectory. But while I don't want to give them credit for what happened, I use those experiences to then mentor other generations, because all of you are incredibly important. I wrote this dissertation with all of you in mind, and I didn't share the poem, but if you allow me, if you haven't read the dissertation, I preface the introduction with this. Most recently, writing a policy brief on the Chicana doctoral production on recipients who began at the community college, frustration came back to haunt me as I was unable to write. I struggled through the infamous academic writing process, trying to remind myself what led me to this work. Fortunately, my complicated state of mind was interrupted with another Chicana student asked to see what I was working on. The community college has a pathway to Chicana doctoral production, which I had on my slide. It was one of the first ones I published on this very topic. I think it was like one of those policy briefs. She saw the title and she asked if she can see it. As I read the data, she mentioned that she was a community college transfer student herself. Holding the manuscript before her, I explained that out of all the Chicano doctors produced between 19 and 2000, 3,000, a little over 3,000, 3,403 to be exact, 1 out of 4, so 771 of them, began at the community college. She stared at the title and clinged onto every word I shared, not looking my way, simply staring at the manuscript. I repeated the statistic. She slowly looked away from the document, stared into my eyes, and with tears engulfed in hers, asked, "So you're telling me there's hope?" It is her hope that drives me. It is the hope of many others. It is my sisters, comadres, hermanos, hermanas, estudiantes, and the many, too many, students of color who were willing and continue to share their struggles and experiences as transfer students, and the many who continue to be pushed, forced, and ultimately walk this path to remind, reiterate, and exclaim that there is hope. It is hope that keeps us going. It is this hope that guides me, and it is this hope that grounds and drives the purpose of this research. And so ultimately, it's the hope that all of you bring forth by being in this program and being committed to aspiring to go on to a doctorate. So all of you inspired me to write this work 15 years ago. So thank you.